The champagne glass shattered against the church floor as Michael Thompson collapsed during his youngest son's first dance as a married man. What should have been Jonathan's perfect wedding day at St. Mary's became a nightmare in seconds. "Dad!" Jonathan's voice cracked as he dropped to his knees beside his father's convulsing body. The wedding guests formed a horrified circle around the fallen patriarch of Millbrook's most respected farming family. Margaret Thompson pushed through the crowd, her mother of the groom dress now forgotten. "Call 911, now!" Her nursing instincts kicked in as she cradled her husband's head. But it was what happened next that would haunt everyone present. The massive lump that had been growing on Michael's back for months suddenly burst through his dress shirt. Dark fluid mixed with something metallic gleamed under the church's stained glass light. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Pastor Jenkins, backing away in shock. The thing protruding from Michael's flesh wasn't natural. It pulsed with its own rhythm, separate from his heartbeat. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Millbrook, Kansas had always been the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your business, and your family's history going back 3 generations. Population 2,847, nestled in the heart of wheat country where the golden fields stretched to meet the endless sky. It was God's country, as the locals like to say, where hard work and honest living still meant something. The Thompson family farm sat on 800 acres of some of the richest soil in the county. Michael Thompson, at 58, was the 3rd generation to work this land. His grandfather had broken the prairie with nothing but a mule and determination. His father had survived the Dust Bowl and the Depression. Now Michael carried on the tradition with the same stubborn pride that ran in Thompson blood. "A man takes care of his own," Michael would tell his 3 children, just as his father had told him. It was more than a saying in the Thompson household. It was gospel. When the crops failed in '08, Michael worked 3 jobs to keep the farm. When his eldest son David needed surgery after a car accident, Michael sold his prize bull rather than accept charity from the church. Margaret Thompson had fallen in love with that stubborn pride 35 years ago when they were high school sweethearts. She'd been the smartest girl in their graduating class, could have gone anywhere, done anything. Instead, she chose love over opportunity, becoming first a nurse at Millbrook General, then a farm wife and mother. She never regretted it, not even during the lean years when they lived on faith and determination. Their youngest, Jonathan, had just married his college sweetheart in what was supposed to be the social event of the season. The whole town had turned out for the wedding at St. Mary's, the same church where Michael and Margaret had exchanged vows decades earlier. 3 generations of Thompsons had worshipped in those pews, been baptized at that altar, and said their final goodbyes in that sanctuary. The lump on Michael's back had first appeared 6 months ago, right after harvest. Margaret had noticed it while helping him out of his work shirt one evening, a small bump between his shoulder blades. "It's nothing, Maggie," he'd insisted when she suggested seeing Dr. Patterson. "Just pulled something moving those feed sacks." But the lump grew. Month by month it swelled and hardened until it was impossible to ignore. Margaret watched her husband wince when he rolled over in bed, saw him favor his left side when lifting hay bales. Still, Michael Thompson was not a man to complain or show weakness. In his world, real men endured pain in silence. The ambulance ride to Millbrook General felt like an eternity. Margaret held Michael's hand as the paramedics worked over him, their faces grim with concentration. The thing protruding from his back had stopped bleeding, but it remained visible through the torn fabric of his dress shirt, a dark, twisted mass that seemed to pulse with its own life. "How long has he had this growth?" asked the lead paramedic, a young man Margaret recognized as the Miller boy from down the road. 6 months, maybe more," Margaret replied, her voice barely steady. "He kept saying it was nothing." At the hospital, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes was the physician on call. She'd only been at Millbrook General for 3 months, having moved from Chicago after her divorce. The small-town pace was supposed to be healing, a chance to reconnect with medicine's simpler purpose. But nothing had prepared her for what she saw when they wheeled Michael Thompson through the emergency room doors. "Get him to Trauma 2, she ordered, pulling on latex gloves, "and call for X-ray, stat." The wedding guests had followed the ambulance to the hospital, filling the waiting room with their formal attire and anxious whispers. Jonathan still wore his tuxedo, his new wife, Sarah, clutching his arm. Margaret's sister, Ruth, had driven the couple's car while they rode in the ambulance. "Mrs. Thompson," Dr. Hayes approached Margaret after an hour of examination, "I need to ask you some questions about your husband's medical history." They sat in a small consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and fear. Margaret twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd developed over 35 years of marriage. "Has Michael ever had surgery before? Any kind of medical procedure where he might have been unconscious for an extended period?" Margaret thought carefully. "He had his appendix out when he was 12, and after he came back from the service he had some kind of treatment at the VA hospital in Topeka. Said it was routine follow-up care." Dr. Hayes made notes. "What year was that?" 1999, maybe 2000. Right after he finished his enlistment. He was only gone for a week." "What did he tell you about this treatment?" "Not much. You know how men are about medical things. Said they just wanted to make sure he was healthy, check for any lingering effects from his service. He came back feeling fine, maybe even better than before." Dr. Hayes nodded, but her expression was troubled. "Mrs. Thompson, the X-rays show several foreign objects in your husband's back and chest cavity. They appear to be metallic, and they're not consistent with any standard medical devices I'm familiar with." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "What kind of objects?" "I can't say for certain without further testing. But they appear to have been placed there surgically, and they've been there for a long time. Years, possibly decades." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. "Are you saying someone put those things in my husband without telling us?" "I'm saying we need to investigate further. I've already contacted a specialist in Kansas City who deals with unusual cases like this. But Mrs. Thompson, there's something else. Your husband's insurance claim has been flagged for review. Apparently, his policy specifically excludes coverage for what they're calling experimental medical conditions." Margaret stared at the doctor in disbelief. "Experimental? Michael's never been part of any experiment. He's just a farmer." In Trauma Room 2, Michael drifted in and out of consciousness. The local anesthetic had numbed the immediate area around the protruding mass, but the pain deeper inside felt like fire spreading through his chest. When he was lucid, fragments of memory floated through his mind like pieces of a half-remembered dream. He remembered the VA hospital in Topeka, but not the way he'd told Margaret. It hadn't been routine follow-up care. He'd been having problems, nightmares, anxiety, trouble sleeping. The Army doctor had been sympathetic, understanding. "We can help with that, soldier. New treatment, completely safe. You'll go to sleep troubled and wake up ready to take on the world." Michael had trusted them. Why wouldn't he? These were military doctors, men who'd taken the same oath to serve that he had. They'd promised the treatment would help him adjust to civilian life, help him be the husband and father his family deserved. But now, lying in the hospital bed 25 years later, Michael began to remember things he'd forgotten, or things he'd been made to forget. The week at the VA hadn't been spent in routine examinations. There had been surgeries, procedures, long periods of unconsciousness, and when he'd awakened, parts of his memory had been fuzzy. "Dad?" Jonathan's voice brought him back to the present. His youngest son stood beside the bed, still in his wedding tuxedo, his face etched with worry. "Son," Michael managed to whisper, I'm sorry about your wedding day. Don't you worry about that, Dad. Sarah and I, we're married now. That's all that matters. You just focus on getting better. But Michael knew it wasn't that simple. Even through the haze of pain medication, he could see the fear in his family's eyes. Not just fear for his health, but fear of the unknown. Fear of what those objects in his body meant, and what it might cost to remove them. Dr. Hayes returned with preliminary test results. The objects were indeed metallic, composed of materials she couldn't readily identify. More troubling, they appeared to be connected to Michael's nervous system in ways that suggested they hadn't been placed there by accident. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to be direct with you," Dr. Hayes said, pulling Margaret aside. "Someone performed unauthorized medical procedures on your husband. These devices were implanted deliberately, and whoever did it took great care to integrate them with his body's systems. But why? What purpose could they serve? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." As word spread through Millbrook about Michael's condition, the community began to rally. The Methodist Church organized a prayer chain. The diner started a collection jar. Even the bank president, Harold Jennings, called to assure Margaret that they wouldn't foreclose on any missed payments during Michael's recovery. But beneath the surface of small-town solidarity, something else was stirring. Phone calls were being made to numbers in Washington, D.C. Files that had been sealed for decades were being pulled from secure storage. And in a nondescript office building in Virginia, men in expensive suits were discussing how to contain a situation that should have stayed buried forever. By evening, 3 more veterans from Michael's unit had been located by family members who'd heard about the incident on local news. 2 were already dead, their deaths attributed to natural causes. The third, Bobby Martinez, lived in Oklahoma and had been experiencing similar symptoms: mysterious lumps, neurological problems, and medical bills his insurance refused to cover. The conspiracy was beginning to unravel, one thread at a time. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes had seen enough in her 15 years of emergency medicine to know when something didn't add up. The metallic objects in Michael Thompson's body weren't medical devices, at least not any she'd encountered in conventional practice. They were too precisely placed, too deliberately integrated with his nervous system to be accidental. That night, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of filing her report through normal channels, she called her mentor from medical school, Dr. Robert Chen at Johns Hopkins. Chen had spent years studying unusual medical cases, particularly those involving veterans. "Elizabeth, what you're describing sounds familiar," Dr. Chen said after she'd explained Michael's condition. "I've seen similar cases over the years, veterans from the late 90s, early 2000s. Always the same pattern: mysterious objects, sealed military records, insurance companies that refuse coverage." "What are you saying, Robert?" "I'm saying your patient might have been part of something he never consented to. There were rumors back then about experimental programs, veterans being used as test subjects without their knowledge. Nothing was ever proven, but the patterns were there." Dr. Hayes hung up the phone with a growing sense of dread. She'd entered medicine to help people, not to uncover conspiracies. But Michael Thompson was her patient now, and she had a duty to help him, whatever that meant. Meanwhile, in the hospital room, Michael was having the first honest conversation with his family in 25 years. The pain medication had loosened his tongue, and memories were surfacing like debris after a storm. "Maggie," he said, reaching for his wife's hand. "I need to tell you something about that week at the VA hospital." Margaret leaned closer, her face etched with concern. "What is it, honey?" "It wasn't routine follow-up. I was having problems after I got out. Bad dreams, couldn't sleep, jumpy all the time. The doctor said they had a new treatment that would help. Said it was completely safe, that I'd be better in a week." Jonathan, still in his rumpled tuxedo, sat in the corner chair. "What kind of treatment, Dad?" Michael closed his eyes, trying to piece together fragments of memory. I don't remember much. They gave me something to make me sleep. Said I'd wake up feeling like a new man. And I did for a while. The nightmares stopped. I could sleep again. I thought it was a miracle. But you never told me about the problems you were having, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. A man doesn't burden his family with his troubles, Michael replied, unconsciously echoing his father's words. Besides, the treatment worked. I came home ready to be the husband and father you deserved. Dr. Hayes entered the room carrying a thick folder. Mr. Thompson, I've been making some calls about your case. I need to ask you some more specific questions about your time at the VA hospital. She pulled up a chair and opened the folder. Do you remember the name of the doctor who treated you? Michael furrowed his brow. Dr. Steinberg, I think. Robert Steinberg. He seemed like a good man, very understanding about what we'd been through. Dr. Hayes made a note. Do you remember signing any consent forms? Any documents about experimental procedures? They said it was all routine paperwork. I signed whatever they put in front of me. Why? What does this have to do with what's happening to me now? Mr. Thompson, I believe you may have been part of an unauthorized medical experiment. The objects in your body aren't natural, and they weren't placed there to help you. Someone used you as a test subject. The room fell silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Jonathan stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Are you saying someone did this to my father on purpose? Jonathan demanded. I'm saying the evidence suggests that possibility, yes. Margaret found her voice. But why? Why would anyone do such a thing? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Outside the hospital room, the implications of Dr. Hayes's discovery were rippling outward like stones thrown into still water. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a family friend who'd served with Michael's older brother in Desert Storm, had been quietly making inquiries of his own. What he'd learned was troubling. Margaret, Sheriff Bradley said, approaching her in the hospital corridor. I need to talk to you about something important. They stepped into the family consultation room where the sheriff closed the door behind them. I've been checking into Michael's military records and they're sealed tighter than Fort Knox. That's unusual for someone who served in peacetime. I also ran the name Dr. Steinberg through some databases. He's not just any doctor. He's connected to military research programs that most people have never heard of. Margaret sank into a chair. Tom, what are you telling me? I'm telling you that your husband might have been caught up in something much bigger than a simple medical mistake. And if that's true, there are going to be people who want to keep it quiet. As if summoned by his words, Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed their insurance company. Mrs. Thompson, this is Janet Morrison from Midwest Health Partners. I'm calling about your husband's claim. I'm afraid we're going to have to deny coverage for his current treatment. On what grounds? Margaret asked, her voice rising. Pre-existing experimental medical condition? It's right there in the fine print of your policy. Any medical issues arising from participation in unauthorized research programs are specifically excluded. Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. We never participated in any research program. According to our records, your husband signed consent forms in 1999 at the Topeka Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Those forms specifically acknowledge participation in an experimental treatment protocol. That's impossible. Michael would never I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson. The decision is final. You'll be responsible for all medical costs related to this condition. Margaret hung up the phone with shaking hands. In one phone call, her family's financial security had evaporated. The medical bills were already mounting into the tens of thousands, and they'd only been at the hospital for one day. Sheriff Bradley watched her face go pale. "What is it?" "They're denying our insurance claim. They're saying Michael participated in some kind of experiment." "Margaret, listen to me carefully. If what I suspect is true, there are people who will go to great lengths to keep this quiet. You need to be careful who you trust." Back in the hospital room, Michael was experiencing something that would change everything. As Dr. Hayes examined the protruding object more closely, it suddenly shifted, retreating slightly back into his body. Michael cried out in pain, but something else happened. A flood of memories that had been buried for 25 years suddenly came rushing back. He remembered the real reason for his week at the VA hospital. The nightmares hadn't been about his military service. They'd been about what happened during his supposed treatment. He remembered waking up during one of the procedures, seeing doctors in surgical masks standing over him. He remembered trying to speak, to move, but finding himself paralyzed by drugs. Most terrifying of all, he remembered Dr. Steinberg's voice. "Subject 7 is responding well to the implantation. Vital signs stable. Memory suppression appears to be holding." "Dad!" Jonathan's voice brought him back to the present. "Dad? What's wrong?" Michael looked at his family with new understanding and growing horror. "They didn't treat me," he whispered. "They used me. I was Subject 7. Dr. Hayes leaned forward. "Subject 7 of what?" "I don't know. But I remember now. There were others. 12 of us total. They called us subjects, not patients." The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to come together. But the picture they formed was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Michael Thompson hadn't been a patient who'd received experimental treatment. He'd been an unwilling test subject in a program that should never have existed. And somewhere, the people responsible were watching, waiting, and planning their next move to keep their secrets buried. The revelation that Michael had been Subject 7 sent shockwaves through the Thompson family and beyond. Dr. Hayes immediately contacted the FBI's Kansas City field office, while Sheriff Bradley began his own investigation into the other 11 subjects from Michael's group. What they discovered painted a picture of systematic abuse that stretched back decades. Within 48 hours, the story began to unravel with terrifying clarity. Bobby Martinez, the veteran from Oklahoma who'd been experiencing similar symptoms, drove through the night to reach Millbrook. His arrival at the hospital brought the first piece of hard evidence that this wasn't an isolated incident. "I kept all my paperwork from the VA," Bobby told Dr. Hayes, spreading yellow documents across the consultation room table. "My wife always said I was a pack rat, but something about that week in Topeka never sat right with me." The documents told a chilling story. 12 veterans, all experiencing post-service adjustment difficulties, had been recruited for what was described as advanced therapeutic intervention. The consent forms were deliberately vague, using medical terminology that obscured the true nature of the procedures. "Look at this," Dr. Hayes pointed to a paragraph buried in the fine print. "It says participants agree to experimental therapeutic device implantation for the treatment of service-related stress disorders." But it doesn't specify what kind of devices or how they work. Margaret studied the papers with growing horror. Michael would never have agreed to this if he'd understood what it meant. "That's the point," Bobby said grimly. "They made sure we didn't understand. We were desperate, willing to try anything to feel normal again. They took advantage of that." The investigation took on new urgency when they learned the fate of the other subjects. Of the 12 men who'd undergone the procedure, 8 were dead. The official causes varied: heart failure, stroke, cancer, suicide, but the timeline was suspicious. Most had died within 15 years of the procedure, far younger than expected for healthy veterans. Sheriff Bradley had been working his contacts in law enforcement and the military, piecing together a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. This program was funded through black budget allocations, he explained to the family. Money that doesn't officially exist for programs that were never supposed to see the light of day. But why? Jonathan asked. What were they trying to accomplish? Near as I can figure, they were testing some kind of long-term monitoring system. The devices they implanted weren't meant to treat anything. They were meant to collect data, biological data, behavioral data, psychological data. They turned these men into unwilling research subjects for life. The financial pressure on the Thompson family was mounting daily. Without insurance coverage, the medical bills were already approaching $75,000. The bank had been understanding initially, but corporate policies were corporate policies. The farm that had been in the family for 3 generations was now at risk. Margaret found herself making impossible choices. She'd taken a leave of absence from her part-time job at the county clerk's office to care for Michael, but they needed every dollar. David, their eldest son, offered to mortgage his own home to help, but Michael refused from his hospital bed. "I won't let my troubles destroy my children's futures," he insisted, though his voice was weak from the constant pain. The community of Millbrook had rallied around the family in typical small-town fashion. The Methodist Church organized a potluck dinner that raised $3,000. The high school football team held a car wash. The local Grain Elevator Association voted to give the Thompsons priority access to equipment during the next planting season. But even community generosity had its limits, and the medical expenses were growing faster than donations could cover them. Dr. Hayes estimated that safely removing all the implanted devices would cost upward of $200,000, money the family simply didn't have. That's when Maria Santos entered the picture. The investigative journalist from the Kansas City Star had been following rumors about military medical experiments for years. When she heard about Michael's case, she drove to Millbrook immediately. "Mr. Thompson," she said, sitting beside his hospital bed with a digital recorder, "I've been investigating cases like yours for the better part of a decade." "You're not alone in this, and you don't have to fight it alone." Maria's investigation had uncovered a web of corruption involving military contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and government officials. The program that had victimized Michael and his fellow veterans was part of a larger pattern of abuse that stretched back to the 1970s. "The people responsible have been covering their tracks for decades," Maria explained. "They've used their influence to silence families, bury records, and eliminate witnesses. But they made one mistake. They didn't count on someone like your wife fighting back." Margaret had indeed become a force to be reckoned with. Her nursing background gave her the medical knowledge to understand what had been done to her husband, while her fierce love for her family provided the motivation to seek justice. She'd been making phone calls, writing letters, and researching everything she could find about military medical experiments. "I won't let them get away with this," she told Maria. "They took 25 years of my husband's health, and now they want us to pay for the privilege of fixing what they broke." The breakthrough came when Dr. Hayes received a call from an unlikely source. Dr. Patricia Williams, a retired military physician, had seen Maria's preliminary reporting and decided to come forward with information she'd been carrying for 20 years. "I was a junior doctor at the Topeka facility when they ran the program," Dr. Williams told them in a conference call. "I was ordered to assist with the procedures, told it was classified medical research. I didn't understand what we were really doing until it was too late." Dr. Williams's testimony provided the missing pieces of the puzzle. The devices implanted in Michael and the other veterans weren't just monitoring equipment. They were designed to slowly release chemicals into their systems over time. The chemicals were supposed to enhance physical performance and reduce psychological trauma, but they hadn't been properly tested for long-term effects. The subjects started getting sick about 10 years after the procedure, Dr. Williams explained. Tumors, neurological problems, organ failure. When we reported the complications, we were told to classify the cases as natural causes and move on. They knew these men would get sick and die? Margaret asked, her voice shaking with rage. They knew it was possible. They decided the research was more important than the subjects' lives. The revelation sparked something in the Millbrook community that no one had expected. What had started as sympathy for a local family in crisis transformed into righteous anger at a system that would sacrifice its own veterans for the sake of secret research. Pastor William Jenkins organized prayer vigils that doubled as protest rallies. The American Legion Post voted unanimously to support the Thompson family's legal battle. Even the local newspaper, which had never taken a political stance stronger than supporting the county fair, published a scathing editorial calling for congressional investigations. But the attention also brought unwanted consequences. Anonymous phone calls began coming to the Thompson house at all hours. Their mailbox was vandalized. Margaret's car tires were slashed while she was visiting Michael in the hospital. "Someone wants us to stop digging," Sheriff Bradley warned. "That tells me we're getting close to something they don't want exposed." The legal battle began in earnest when a team of attorneys from Kansas City agreed to take the case pro bono. The lead attorney, Sarah Mitchell, had spent years fighting military contractors and government agencies on behalf of veterans. "This is exactly the kind of case that needs to be fought," she told the family. "Not just for you, but for every veteran who's been victimized by illegal medical experiments." The government's response was swift and predictable. They claimed the procedures had been fully legal and properly authorized. They produced documents showing that all subjects had given informed consent. They argued that any health problems were coincidental and not related to the experimental treatments. But their position began to crumble when Dr. Williams provided copies of the real records, documents that showed the true nature of the experiments and the cover-up that followed. The contrast between the official records and the real ones was damning. Michael's condition, meanwhile, continued to deteriorate. The objects in his body were causing increasing complications. His liver function was declining, and he was experiencing episodes of cardiac irregularity. Dr. Hayes was running out of options for treating him within the confines of conventional medicine. "We need to remove these devices," she told the family during one of their daily consultations. "But the surgery is extremely risky. There's a significant chance he won't survive the procedure." "And if we don't remove them?" Margaret asked. "The chemical contamination will eventually cause organ failure. Without intervention, he has maybe 6 months." The family faced an impossible choice: risk losing Michael immediately through surgery, or watch him die slowly from the poison in his body. It was Jonathan who suggested a third option. "What if we could find someone who's dealt with these specific devices before? Someone who knows how they were put in and how to safely take them out?" It was a long shot, but Dr. Williams might know of military doctors who'd been involved in the original procedures. If they could find someone with that specialized knowledge, Michael might have a better chance of surviving the removal surgery. The search led them to Dr. Elizabeth Kane, a former military surgeon who'd left the service under mysterious circumstances in 2001. Dr. Kane was now working at a private clinic in Colorado, specializing in unusual surgical cases that other doctors wouldn't touch. "I remember the program," Dr. Kane admitted when Dr. Hayes contacted her. "I was ordered to design the implantation procedures. It was supposed to be humanitarian, helping veterans adjust to civilian life. I didn't learn about the real purpose until years later." Dr. Kane agreed to travel to Kansas to evaluate Michael's case, but she warned that the surgery would be unlike anything attempted before. The devices had been designed to integrate with the body's systems in ways that made removal extremely dangerous. "We're talking about microsurgery that could take 15 hours, she explained. "And there's no guarantee we can remove everything without causing permanent damage." As Michael's condition worsened and the legal battle intensified, The Thompson family found themselves at the center of a storm that threatened to destroy everything they'd built together. But they also discovered something unexpected, a reservoir of strength they never knew they possessed, and a community willing to stand with them against overwhelming odds. The fight for justice was just beginning, and the costs, financial, emotional, and physical, would test every bond that held the family together. The decision to proceed with the experimental surgery came on a Thursday morning when Michael's kidneys began to fail. Dr. Kane had arrived from Colorado the night before, and after examining Michael's latest test results, she delivered the grim verdict that everyone had been dreading. "The chemical contamination has reached critical levels," she announced to the assembled family in the hospital conference room. "If we don't operate within the next 48 hours, organ failure will become irreversible." Margaret gripped Michael's hand so tightly, her knuckles turned white. What are his chances? Honestly, 50-50 at best. The devices have been in his body for 25 years. They've grown into his nervous system, integrated with major blood vessels. Removing them is like trying to extract roots from concrete without breaking the foundation. The surgery was scheduled for Saturday morning. Dr. Kane would lead a team of specialists flown in from Kansas City and Denver, each expert in a different aspect of the complex procedure. The hospital's board had initially balked at allowing such an experimental operation, but media pressure and community support had forced their hand. Maria Santos's articles in the Kansas City Star had sparked national attention. CNN picked up the story, followed by Fox News and MSNBC. Suddenly, Millbrook General Hospital was at the center of a media circus that threatened to overwhelm the small facility's resources. "This is bigger than Michael now," Margaret confided to Pastor Jenkins as they sat in the hospital chapel the night before surgery. "People are watching us from all over the country. Veterans' families who never got answers about their own loved ones." Pastor Jenkins nodded solemnly. "Sometimes the Lord calls us to be witnesses for others who can't speak for themselves." Michael's suffering may serve a purpose larger than we can understand. The legal battle had intensified as well. The government's attorneys were fighting to have the case dismissed on national security grounds, arguing that public disclosure of the medical experiments would harm ongoing military research programs. But Sarah Mitchell and her team had filed for emergency injunctions to prevent the destruction of evidence, and sympathetic judges were beginning to rule in their favor. "They're scared," Sarah told Margaret during a strategy session in the hospital's family lounge. "When powerful people start making legal threats this aggressively, it means they know they're going to lose." The financial situation remained desperate. Even with pro bono legal representation, the medical costs were astronomical. The experimental surgery alone would cost $150,000, not including the extended recovery period that would follow. The community fundraising efforts had generated nearly $50,000, but it wasn't enough. That's when an unexpected ally emerged. Veterans organizations across Kansas had begun organizing their own fundraising campaigns. The American Legion, VFW, and Disabled American Veterans were pooling resources in unprecedented cooperation. Word spread through social media and veteran networks, and donations began pouring in from across the country. "It's not just about the money," explained Bob Crawford, state commander of the Kansas VFW. "It's about accountability. If they did this to Michael Thompson, they did it to others. We need to know how many of our brothers and sisters were victimized by their own government." The night before surgery, Michael was unusually lucid despite the pain medication. He asked to speak with each family member privately, starting with Margaret. "Maggie, if something happens tomorrow, I need you to know that these have been the best years of my life. Not because of what was done to me, but because of what we built together despite it." Margaret wiped away tears she'd been holding back for weeks. "Don't you talk like that, Michael Thompson. You're going to survive this surgery, and we're going to grow old together on that farm. Maybe, but if I don't, I need you to promise me something. Don't let them sweep this under the rug. Don't let my suffering be for nothing. Other families need to know the truth. His conversation with Jonathan was equally emotional. Son, I'm proud of the man you've become. I'm sorry your wedding day got ruined by all this. Dad, forget about the wedding. We can have 100 weddings. There's only one you. Michael smiled weakly. Take care of your mother if something happens, and don't let them take the farm. It's been in our family for 3 generations. Don't let it end with me. As word spread about the surgery, something remarkable happened in Millbrook. The entire town seemed to converge on the hospital. The parking lot filled with pickup trucks and sedans. The waiting room overflowed with neighbors, friends, and complete strangers who'd driven from other counties to show support. Sheriff Bradley had to coordinate with the state patrol to manage traffic. Local restaurants donated food for the crowd. The high school marching band even showed up to play hymns in the hospital courtyard. I've never seen anything like it, Dr. Hayes marveled. It's like the whole state has adopted your family. The surgery began at 6 a.m. on Saturday morning. Dr. Kane and her team worked with methodical precision, guided by real-time imaging that showed the location of every foreign object in Michael's body. The first device, lodged near his spine, took 3 hours to remove. It was a small metallic cylinder, about the size of a pen cap, with hair-thin wires that had grown into his nervous system. My God, Dr. Kane whispered as she examined the device under magnification. This is incredibly sophisticated. Someone spent years developing this technology. The second device, embedded in his chest cavity, proved even more challenging. It had integrated with major blood vessels, requiring microsurgery to separate it without causing a massive hemorrhage. 4 hours into the operation, Michael's blood pressure dropped dangerously low. We're losing him, the anesthesiologist announced. In the waiting room, Margaret felt her knees give out when Dr. Hayes emerged with updates. There have been complications, but Dr. Kane is handling them. Michael's strong. He's fighting. The crowd in the waiting room joined hands spontaneously, forming a prayer circle that stretched through multiple corridors. Pastor Jenkins led them in reciting the 23rd Psalm, his voice carrying over the hushed whispers of 200 people united in hope. Hour by hour, the surgery continued. Dr. Kane removed 5 devices in total, each one requiring delicate extraction procedures. The largest was found wrapped around Michael's aorta, pulsing with his heartbeat in a grotesque parody of life. This one's been monitoring his cardiovascular system for decades, Dr. Kane explained to her team. It's been recording every heartbeat, every stress response. Someone has a complete biological profile of this man spanning 25 years. By hour 12, Michael's vital signs had stabilized, but Dr. Kane wasn't finished. The imaging showed fragments of a 6th device, scattered pieces that would require precise removal to prevent future complications. We can't leave anything behind, she told her exhausted team. If even one piece remains, the chemical contamination will continue. The final phase of surgery lasted another 3 hours. When Dr. Kane finally emerged from the operating room at 9 p.m., she looked like she'd aged a decade in a single day. The waiting room fell silent as she approached Margaret. He made it, she said simply. We removed everything we could find. The next 48 hours will be critical, but his vital signs are stable. The cheer that went up from the waiting room could be heard throughout the hospital. Margaret collapsed into her children's arms, finally allowing herself to cry tears of relief instead of fear. But even as they celebrated this victory, the larger battle was far from over. The devices Dr. Kane had removed were now evidence in a federal investigation that was expanding daily. FBI agents had secured the operating room to preserve the chain of custody, treating the extracted objects like criminal evidence rather than medical waste. "This is the break we've been waiting for," Sarah Mitchell told the family as they gathered around Michael's recovery bed. "Physical evidence that proves what was done to him. They can't deny it or explain it away." Dr. Kane had documented everything meticulously, creating a detailed record of each device's location, condition, and apparent function. Her preliminary analysis suggested they were far more sophisticated than anything she'd encountered in military medicine. "These weren't crude experiments," she explained to Maria Santos in an exclusive interview. "Someone invested enormous resources in developing this technology. This represents years of research and millions of dollars in development costs." As Michael slowly regained consciousness in the intensive care unit, surrounded by machines monitoring his recovery, he looked up at Margaret with clear eyes for the first time in months. "Is it over?" he whispered. "The surgery's over, honey. Dr. Kane got everything out." "No," Michael shook his head slightly. "I mean, is it really over? Are we safe now?" Margaret looked around the room at the FBI agents stationed outside, the media crews camped in the parking lot, and the stack of legal documents that seemed to grow larger every day. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Outside the hospital, the victory celebration was tempered by the knowledge that they'd only won the first battle in what promised to be a long war. The people responsible for Michael's suffering were still free, still powerful, and still determined to protect their secrets at any cost. The extracted devices had been sent to FBI laboratories for analysis, while copies of all medical records were being reviewed by congressional investigators. The story was growing beyond a single family's tragedy into a national scandal that threatened to expose decades of government abuse. But for tonight, it was enough that Michael Thompson was alive, free from the foreign objects that had poisoned his body for 25 years, and surrounded by a community that had proven that ordinary people could still stand up to extraordinary injustice. The real test would come in the days ahead, when the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge and the people responsible began fighting back with all the resources at their disposal. The first sign that their victory would be short-lived came 72 hours after Michael's surgery. Margaret was sitting beside his hospital bed, reading him get-well cards from supporters across the country, when Sheriff Bradley appeared in the doorway with a grim expression. "Margaret, we need to talk," he said quietly. "Privately." They stepped into the hallway, where Bradley's usual confident demeanor had been replaced by visible concern. "I just got word from my contacts in federal law enforcement. The FBI lab results on Michael's devices came back and they're not what we expected." "What do you mean?" "The devices were wiped clean before we could extract meaningful data. Someone had programmed them to self-destruct their memory storage if they were ever removed from a living host. All we've got now is empty hardware." Margaret felt the floor shift beneath her feet. "But Dr. Kane documented everything. We have her surgical records, the photographs, which any government attorney will argue could have been fabricated. Without the data from the devices themselves, it's much harder to prove what they were actually doing." The news got worse. Dr. Patricia Williams, the retired military physician who had provided crucial testimony about the original experiments, had been found dead in her Colorado home. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but the timing was suspicious enough to raise questions that would never be answered. "They're cleaning house," Sheriff Bradley explained. "Anyone who can testify about the original program is either being silenced or discredited." Michael's recovery, meanwhile, was not progressing as hoped. While the surgery had successfully removed all the foreign devices, his body was struggling to heal from 25 years of chemical contamination. His liver function remained poor, and he was experiencing episodes of confusion and memory loss. It's like his system doesn't know how to function without those devices, Dr. Hayes explained to the family. They'd been regulating certain biological processes for so long that his body had stopped doing it naturally. The financial situation had grown desperate despite the community fundraising efforts. The surgery costs alone had exceeded $200,000, and Michael would need months of specialized treatment that their insurance continued to refuse to cover. The farm was falling behind on mortgage payments, and bankruptcy loomed as a very real possibility. Jonathan had moved back home temporarily to help manage the farm operations, but the stress was taking its toll on his new marriage. Sarah, his wife, tried to be supportive, but the constant crisis atmosphere was wearing on everyone. "I don't know how much more of this we can take," Margaret confided to Pastor Jenkins during one of her daily visits to the hospital chapel. "Michael's getting sicker instead of better. We're drowning in debt, and now they're saying our evidence isn't good enough." "Faith isn't the absence of doubt, Margaret," Pastor Jenkins replied. "It's continuing to do what's right, even when everything seems hopeless." The legal battle had indeed taken a disturbing turn. Government attorneys were arguing that Michael's medical problems were pre-existing conditions unrelated to his military service. They produced medical experts who testified that the devices found in his body were consistent with legitimate medical treatments he might have received for combat-related stress. "They're rewriting history," Sarah Mitchell told the family during a strategy session at the hospital. "They've had 25 years to perfect their cover story, and they're using every resource at their disposal to discredit us." The media attention that had initially helped their cause was beginning to work against them. Conservative commentators questioned why taxpayers should fund medical treatment for what they called alleged government experiments, while liberal outlets portrayed the family as naive victims being manipulated by conspiracy theorists. "The court of public opinion is fickle," Maria Santos warned Margaret. "People lose interest quickly when stories become complicated. We need something dramatic to refocus attention on what really happened to Michael." That dramatic event came in the form of a second medical crisis. 6 weeks after his surgery, Michael began experiencing severe neurological symptoms. He would lose consciousness without warning. His body would convulse, and when he awakened, he had no memory of the episodes. "It's like his brain is misfiring," Dr. Hayes explained to the family after the third episode in 2 days. "The chemical damage may have been more extensive than we realized." Dr. Kane flew back from Colorado to evaluate Michael's condition. Her assessment was devastating. The devices weren't just monitoring his biological functions, they were actively regulating them. Without that artificial support, his nervous system is shutting down. "Are you saying the devices were keeping him alive?" Margaret asked. "In a sense, yes. They'd been compensating for damage they were simultaneously causing. It's diabolical. They created a dependency that would make removal potentially fatal." The family faced another impossible choice. They could attempt experimental treatment to restore Michael's neurological function, but it would require relocating to a specialized facility in Switzerland. The cost would be astronomical, over $500,000, and there was no guarantee of success. "We can't afford it," David said bluntly during a family meeting. "We've already lost the farm. Mom's medical insurance through the county is about to run out." "We're talking about money we'll never have." "Then we'll mortgage everything," Margaret replied firmly. "The house, whatever equity is left in the farm, my retirement account, I'm not giving up on your father." "Mom, be realistic," Sarah interjected. "Even if we could raise the money, what if the treatment doesn't work? You'd be left with nothing." The argument that followed was the most heated the Thompson family had ever experienced. David and Sarah wanted to focus on making Michael comfortable and preserving what little financial security remained. Jonathan and Margaret insisted on pursuing every possible treatment regardless of cost. "This isn't just about Dad anymore," Jonathan argued. "If we give up now, everyone who's been supporting us will think we were wrong." Other families going through the same thing will lose hope. The dispute was tearing the family apart just when they needed unity most. Michael, during his lucid moments, was aware of the conflict and blamed himself for destroying his children's relationships. "Maybe it would be better if I just let nature take its course," he told Margaret during one of his clearer periods. "I've already cost this family everything. I won't let my selfishness cost you each other." "Don't you dare talk like that, Michael Thompson," Margaret replied fiercely. "We're going to fight this thing until there's no fight left in us." But the fight was taking its toll on everyone. Margaret had lost 20 pounds and looked years older than she had 6 months earlier. The stress had triggered a recurrence of the high blood pressure she'd battled in her 40s. Jonathan's marriage was strained to the breaking point. David had been forced to take unpaid leave from his job to help with the farm, jeopardizing his own family's financial security. The community support that had been so strong initially was beginning to waver. People had their own problems, their own bills to pay. The initial outpouring of donations had slowed to a trickle, and some of the most vocal supporters were quietly distancing themselves as the story became more complicated and controversial. "Folks are getting tired of the drama," Sheriff Bradley admitted to Margaret. "They want to help, but this has been going on for months now with no end in sight." The final blow came when their attorney, Sarah Mitchell, received word that the government was prepared to offer a settlement. They would pay all of Michael's medical expenses to date and provide a modest compensation package in exchange for the family's agreement to cease all legal action and public statements about the case. "It's not nearly what you deserve," Sarah explained, "but it would solve your immediate financial problems and guarantee Michael's continued medical care." "What's the catch?" Margaret asked. "Total silence. You sign a non-disclosure agreement that prevents you from ever speaking publicly about what happened. No interviews, no books, no testimony before Congress. The story dies here." The offer forced the family to confront the reality that their fight for justice might be futile. The government had unlimited resources and decades of experience covering up embarrassing scandals. The Thompson family had determination and community support, but those might not be enough against such overwhelming odds. As Michael's condition continued to deteriorate, they had to decide whether to accept the settlement and focus on his medical care, or continue fighting for a principle that might cost them everything they had left. The decision would define not just their family's future, but also determine whether the truth about government medical experiments would ever be fully exposed. Other families were watching, waiting to see if ordinary citizens could still hold their government accountable for decades-old crimes. Time was running out, and the stakes had never been higher. The truth began to unravel in the most unexpected way. While the Thompson family agonized over the government's settlement offer, a maintenance worker at Millbrook General Hospital made a discovery that would change everything. Jimmy Kowalski had been cleaning out old storage rooms in the basement when he found a box of medical files that had been misfiled decades earlier. Among the yellowed papers was a complete set of records from the 1999 experimental program, records that had supposedly been destroyed years ago. More importantly, these files contained something the government thought they'd eliminated: detailed documentation of the real purpose behind the medical experiments. Sheriff Bradley examined the documents with growing amazement. "Margaret, you need to see this," he said, spreading the papers across the hospital conference room table. "These aren't treatment records, they're research protocols. They show exactly what they were trying to accomplish." The files revealed that the experimental program had been designed to test long-term biological monitoring systems for military personnel. The devices implanted in Michael and the other veterans were prototypes for technology intended to track soldiers' health, stress levels, and psychological state in real time during combat operations. They weren't trying to help these men, Sheriff Bradley explained. They were using them as test subjects to develop surveillance technology for future soldiers. Dr. Hayes studied the medical protocols with professional outrage. According to these records, they knew the devices would cause health problems over time. They built in a 20-year lifespan specifically because they wanted to study the long-term effects of the chemical compounds being released. Margaret felt sick as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. "You're saying they expected Michael to get sick? That was part of the plan?" According to this, Sheriff Bradley pointed to a particular passage, they anticipated that approximately 70% of subjects would experience significant health deterioration within 20 years of implantation. They considered that an acceptable loss rate for the data they were collecting. The discovery of the files coincided with another revelation. Maria Santos had been investigating the financial trail behind the experimental program and discovered that it had been funded not just by the military, but by a consortium of private defense contractors who stood to profit from the surveillance technology. This wasn't just a rogue military program, Maria explained to the family. This was a joint venture between the Pentagon and private industry. Companies that are still in business today, still receiving government contracts. Among the corporate sponsors was Blackstone Security Solutions, a company that had grown from a small defense contractor in the 1990s to a multi-billion-dollar corporation with contracts around the world. Their current CEO, Robert Steinberg Jr., was the son of the Dr. Steinberg who had originally recruited Michael and the other veterans. "It's a family business," Maria said grimly. "The father developed the technology, and the son has been profiting from it for decades." The revelation energized the legal team. Sarah Mitchell immediately filed motions to compel discovery of all records related to Blackstone Security Solutions and their involvement in the experimental program. The newly discovered hospital files provided the missing link that connected the medical experiments to ongoing corporate profits. "This changes everything," Sarah told the family. "We're not just fighting the government anymore. We're taking on a major defense contractor with billions of dollars at stake." But the discovery also brought new dangers. Within days of the files being found, Jimmy Kowalski was offered a generous severance package and early retirement from the hospital. When he declined, he was terminated for budget reasons. The message was clear. People who helped the Thompson family would face consequences. Michael's condition had stabilized somewhat, but he remained weak and prone to neurological episodes. The discovery of the files had given him new purpose, however. For the first time since his surgery, he seemed focused on something beyond his own survival. "They planned this," he told Margaret during one of his clearer moments. "They knew we'd get sick, and they just watched it happen. How many other families went through what we're going through thinking it was just bad luck?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Kane, the surgeon who had removed Michael's devices, had been conducting her own investigation into similar cases. She'd found records of at least 40 other veterans who had undergone similar procedures at various military hospitals between 1995 and 2005. "The program was much larger than we initially thought," Dr. Kane reported. "They conducted experiments at facilities across the country, always using the same cover story about treating post-service stress disorders. Most of the other subjects had died within 15 years of their procedures, their deaths attributed to various natural causes. Their families had never suspected that their loved ones had been victims of illegal medical experiments." "We need to contact these families," Margaret insisted. "They deserve to know the truth about what happened to their husbands and fathers." But reaching out to other families proved more complicated than expected. Many had moved on with their lives, reluctant to reopen old wounds. Others were afraid of legal retaliation if they spoke out against the government. A few had been paid settlements years earlier in exchange for their silence. The breakthrough came when Bobby Martinez, the Oklahoma veteran who had been experiencing similar symptoms, agreed to undergo surgery to have his own devices removed. Dr. Kane performed the procedure, and this time they were prepared to preserve every piece of evidence. Bobby's devices were still active, Dr. Kane reported after the surgery. They'd been transmitting data continuously for 25 years. We were able to trace the signals to a receiving station operated by Blackstone Security Solutions. The evidence was now overwhelming. The government and their corporate partners had been conducting illegal surveillance of American veterans for decades, using their bodies as unwitting test beds for military technology. The public response was immediate and angry. Veterans organizations that had been cautiously supportive now demanded congressional investigations. Editorial writers across the country called for accountability. Social media campaigns spread the hashtag #JusticeForMichael to millions of Americans. But the government's response was equally swift. They filed motions to have all evidence declared classified under national security provisions. They argued that public disclosure of the surveillance technology would harm ongoing military operations and endanger American troops. They're hiding behind national security to cover up their crimes, Sarah Mitchell told a packed courtroom during one of the preliminary hearings. They can't be allowed to use the very soldiers they victimized as an excuse for avoiding accountability. The judge's ruling would determine whether the case could proceed. If the evidence was classified, the Thompson family would have no way to prove their claims in court. If it remained public, they would have the strongest case against government medical experiments in decades. As they waited for the decision, Michael experienced what Dr. Hayes feared might be his final crisis. His neurological symptoms had worsened to the point where he was losing consciousness several times a day. His liver function was declining rapidly, and his kidneys were beginning to fail. The damage from 25 years of chemical exposure is catching up with him, Dr. Hayes explained to the family. His body is shutting down system by system. Margaret refused to give up hope, but she could see that time was running out. Michael needed immediate access to experimental treatments that were only available in Europe, and they still didn't have the money to pay for them. That's when the veterans community stepped up in a way no one had expected. The American Legion announced that they were establishing an emergency fund specifically for victims of illegal medical experiments. The VFW pledged matching donations. Individual veterans from across the country began sending whatever they could afford. "We take care of our own," explained Bob Crawford from the Kansas VFW. "Michael Thompson served his country with honor, and his country failed him. The least we can do is make sure he gets the medical care he needs." The fundraising effort raised over $300,000 in 2 weeks, enough to get Michael to Switzerland for the experimental treatment. But as the family prepared to leave the country, they faced a heartbreaking choice. Pursuing Michael's medical care would mean abandoning the legal fight just when they were on the verge of victory. The government settlement offer remained on the table, guaranteeing Michael's medical expenses in exchange for their silence. The corporate defendants had added their own financial incentives, offering enough money to ensure the family's financial security for life. But accepting the money would mean that the truth about the experimental program would never be fully exposed, and other families would never get the justice they deserved. As Michael's condition deteriorated and the legal deadlines approached, the Thompson family faced their most difficult decision yet. The decision came to Margaret in the quiet hours before dawn, as she sat beside Michael's hospital bed watching his labored breathing. He'd been unconscious for 18 hours, his body finally succumbing to the decades of chemical poisoning. Dr. Hayes had warned the family to prepare for the worst. But something had changed during the night. Michael's vital signs had mysteriously stabilized. When he opened his eyes that morning, they were clearer than they'd been in months. "Maggie," he whispered, reaching for her hand. "I heard everything. The files, the evidence, the settlement offer. I know what we have to do. Michael, you need to rest. Don't worry about any of that right now. No, listen to me. We're not taking their money. We're going to fight this thing to the end, whatever it costs us. Margaret felt tears welling up. Honey, the treatment in Switzerland could save your life. If we turn down the settlement, we might not be able to afford it. Then that's a risk we'll have to take. But I won't let them buy our silence. Too many families have suffered because people like us took their money and kept quiet. The family meeting that followed was unlike any they'd had before. For the first time in months, Michael was strong enough to participate fully in the discussion. His decision to reject the settlement was unanimous. Even David and Sarah, who had previously advocated for financial caution, agreed that the principle was more important than the money. "Dad's right," David said. "If we take their money now, we'll never be able to look ourselves in the mirror again." Sarah Mitchell was amazed when the family informed her of their decision. "Are you absolutely certain? This settlement would solve all your financial problems and guarantee Michael's medical care for life." "We're certain," Margaret replied firmly. "This isn't about money anymore. It's about making sure this never happens to another family." The trial that followed captivated the nation. The courtroom was packed daily with veterans, families of deceased test subjects, and supporters from across the country. Media coverage was extensive, with major networks providing live updates on the proceedings. The government's defense crumbled when faced with the documentary evidence from the misfiled hospital records. Dr. Kane's testimony about the sophistication of the implanted devices was devastating to their claims that the procedures had been legitimate medical treatments. Most damaging of all was the testimony of Dr. Patricia Williams' daughter, who revealed that her mother had left behind a detailed confession before her death. The document outlined the entire experimental program and named every official who had been involved in the cover-up. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning a verdict in favor of the Thompson family. The damages awarded were substantial, enough to cover all of Michael's medical expenses and provide compensation for decades of suffering. More importantly, the verdict established legal precedent that would help other families seek justice. But the real victory came in the form of congressional legislation passed 6 months later. The Veterans Medical Accountability Act required full disclosure of all past experimental programs and established strict oversight for future military medical research. It also created a compensation fund for victims of unauthorized medical experiments. Michael's health improved dramatically once he received treatment in Switzerland. The experimental procedures successfully reversed much of the neurological damage, and within a year he was well enough to return to limited farming activities. The Thompson family farm was saved, but more importantly, their fight had opened the door for dozens of other families to seek answers about their own loved ones. Support groups were established across the country for families affected by military medical experiments. On the 5th anniversary of his surgery, Michael stood before a crowd of veterans and their families at a memorial service for those who had died as a result of the experimental programs. "We cannot bring back those we lost," he said, his voice strong and clear. "But we can make sure their sacrifice meant something. We can make sure this never happens again." Margaret watched from the audience, her heart full of pride for the man who had chosen principle over safety, truth over comfort. They had won more than a legal victory. They had won the right for future generations to trust that their government would never again treat its own citizens as expendable test subjects. The fight had cost them dearly, but it had also revealed the strength that comes from standing up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost. Michael Thompson's story reminds us that the greatest victories in life often come from the hardest battles we never wanted to fight. At 58, this Kansas farmer could have taken the easy path, accepted the government settlement money, and lived quietly with his pain. Instead, he and his beloved wife Margaret chose something more precious than financial security. They chose to stand up for what was right, even when it meant risking everything they'd built together over 35 years of marriage. Their courage didn't just save Michael's life. It opened the door for dozens of other military families to find answers and healing. When we reach our golden years, we discover that true happiness isn't found in avoiding struggle, but in knowing we used our remaining strength to make a difference. The Thompson family learned that love grows stronger under pressure, that communities rally around principles worth defending, and that speaking truth to power can create legacies that outlast any bank account. Their farm was saved, but more importantly, their children and grandchildren inherited something priceless, the knowledge that ordinary people can still change the world when they refuse to stay silent. What principles in your own life have you been willing to fight for, regardless of the cost? Have you ever had to choose between financial security and doing what you knew was right? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else facing their own difficult choice.